2.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of PHP Release Radar, this time about PHP Stand. It's been a while, we were really looking forward to this episode and are happy to welcome Ondrej today, who is the creator of PHP Stand. And before we start, a few organizational things. There is a chat on the right hand side on YouTube if you're joining us in a live stream, where you can ask questions and we will try to forward them to Ondrej so you can get the answers right away. But to be clear, we have a 10 seconds delay, so it might take more than 10 seconds for a question to be answered. So don't be angry with us. But let's get started. Ondrej, welcome, and of course congratulations to your 1.0 release of PHP Stand. Before we head into the release, would you mind give us a quick introduction? Who are you and how did you start with PHP?
All right, hello, I'm Ondrej Mirtes, and I'm really glad that you have me here for your interview series. So I would like to talk a bit about my career and how I arrived at creating PHP Stand. So I hope that it's not going to be too boring. So if I look at something that connects my whole career, is that I've always been pushed forward by things that I liked and admired. So at the beginning, when I got my first computer with Windows 95 and 98 installed on it, I admired that I could double click an exe file and it would open a window. So the first thing that I created after I clicked around in Microsoft Word and played games for a few years is that I wanted to create an exe application that opens a window. So I got a book about C++ Builder, and of course I was completely clueless, so I didn't know what a variable is. So when I wanted to store some data, I just stored it as hidden labels in the open windows as UI elements. So that's how I started. Then I wanted to create websites, so I actually started writing HTML in Notepad. Then I was creating them in Microsoft Front Page. Then even in Microsoft Word, not many people know that you can export
You can export to
websites
HTML, right? Yeah.
in Microsoft Word. And after I saw that it's a bad idea, I started writing in Notepad again. So the next thing that pushed me forward was that the adjacent class in our high school had their own website with CMS, with the content management system. So I wanted to learn an actual programming language, so I could also create my own website with my own CMS. And of course, again, I was completely clueless, so I needed to figure out when the URL has an ID. For example, index.php !id equals 123. I had to figure out how it works. So at the beginning, I thought that the index.php file has all the articles stored in it, so they could be found by an ID. So I was completely clueless again. But eventually, I learned about relation databases and how things are done for real. As an aside, I was also in high school. I was also writing reviews about computer games for online magazines, and one thing that inspired me was that they had a CMS called Genesis. So when I was creating my own CMS, I called it Nemesis. So it just sounded similarly. And eventually I discovered the world of frameworks. I started using popular Czech framework called Nete. It's not very well known outside of Czech Republic, but it's the most used framework in the Czech Republic, and I was a big part of that community. And I had something like thousands of posts on the Nete forum, and this actually landed me my first job. And I started working in a new web development agency in 2010 as a Nete expert, because they wanted to base their system in Nete framework. And this was during my second year at the university. This also means that I actually never worked as a junior, because I already started as an expert in this field, in knowing how to write web applications using Nete framework in PHP. And besides web development, I was also mesmerized by the world of iPhones and iOS apps. So I also wanted to learn how to make iOS apps, and I even created my own iOS app, which is in the App Store to this day, although it's very neglected at this point and it doesn't support the new devices and so on. So I didn't follow more into the iOS development, and I returned to web development, but it actually inspired me how many developers are independent, they work on their own, and they work on their own applications. So I wanted to achieve a similar thing, and back then it didn't occur to me that it would be this open source thing. I always thought that I would achieve this career path by making some kind of mobile app or something like that.
Mhm.
So I finished my master's degree in 2014, and I landed a job as a PHP developer at Slevomat, which is something like Groupon, but also Czech specific. And I learned a lot there. It's a big application with many users, and I've been mostly responsible for the card checkout process, but I also contributed a lot of other parts as well. And at Slevomat, I started an open source package called Slevomat Coding Standard for PHP Code Sniffer. But after I had my hands full with other open source work with PHP Stand, I transferred the ownership of the project to my colleague slash boss, Jarda Hanslík, which goes by the GitHub username Kukulich, Kukulich. So maybe some people are aware of his work, and he has been taking care of Selman Coding Standard since then. So this was about my career, and this was everything except for PHP Stand, and the rest of the story is going to be about PHP Stand.
Okay,
So
so that means that you're more or less you started as a self-taught developer
mhm,
back in the school time,
yeah,
and I remember when I was starting with front page as well and going to Dreamweaver, and I think it was a front page was able to have something dynamic with ASP.NET back then or something like that, and
I think that back then JavaScript was called actually the HTML, like dynamic HTML.
yeah, yeah, and I think those are the days and those are the things usually PHP developers start with, right? We want to do
Yeah,
something in the browser, and then we want to do it in our own CMS.
yeah,
That's
exactly.
that's not. I think that's a very typical thing, and that's something that is quite good for the learn curve as well. And I think
Mhm.
I heard about Netta before because there's a lot of um, it's mentioned a lot in the documentation of Rector. I think there are a lot of rectors migrating something from Netted to a different framework.
Yeah, that's kind of expected because the Rector creator Tomáš Votruba is
Yeah,
also Czech, so he's also very familiar
yeah,
with Nete.
yeah. We might come to Rector maybe a bit later
Yeah.
because that's also an interesting project. Small side note regarding volume of the microphone. I pitched mine a bit down, so maybe it's valuable to rise the volume.
So my microphone is too low or too high, or
If you can rise yours, that would be awesome. But I think
volume of
mine's.
mine, volume of my microphone. Yeah, I think I can. So is it better now?
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I've
Hopefully
increased
it's
it.
very loud, so hopefully I will look at the chat and let you
Yeah.
know if
So I
that's
hope it's
Great.
better
fine.
now.
Thanks. Um, so, but you started as a PHP developer, did the typical things like inventing your own CMS, and of course iOS. Well, someone who's keen to change parts in the browser might be keen to change things on the mobile device as well. So that's very, very.
Yeah, it actually inspired me a lot when I was writing the checkout process for Slevomat because it was a lot of JavaScript.
Mhm.
So I paid a lot of attention to the detail. So, for example, the checkout process at Slevomat, it's still the same since I wrote the first version in
Mhm.
2014 or 2015. It's a long page, and I paid a lot of attention where the page is scrolled. So I made sure that it doesn't make too much movement, then it's necessary. I just wanted always to scroll to the important part that should be in the viewport, but I also made sure that it's not it's not too fast and it's not making people motion sick and stuff like that.
Yeah, but when we talk about your first steps in the browser and you care about the viewport or care about apps on mobile device, how does it come that PHP Stand is more about the code and language level and not about UI? So is that a
Yeah, but
shift?
it's
So how
still
did it
important
start?
to yeah, it's still important to care about the user experience. So I pay a lot of attention to the error messages so that they are understandable. Yeah. Also, the performance is a lot of part of the user experience. So I make sure that it's fast. So yeah. So the fact that I care about user experience doesn't mean that I can't get technical as well. So
Yeah, yeah, that's right, that's right, and I think there were a lot of changes in PHP and about that as well, and we will talk about performance later. So, is it possible to describe PHP Stand in one or two sentences?
I
What
don't
do
know
you
about
think?
one or two sentences because I'm used to talk about it for hours, but
Yeah.
I will try. So it's uh, it's a static analyzer, and the thing that inspired me to do it is that when I was studying at the university, I was already a PHP developer, but we were forced to work with Java, and PHP was very frowned upon. But that's a different story because it had a bad reputation back then.
Mm-hmm.
So what I liked about Java is that its compiler was finding errors in your source code. So if you had call to an undefined method or you were accessing an undefined variable and stuff like that, the compiler found the error for you and you weren't able to run the application if anywhere in the source code was an error like this. But of course, PHP is totally different, and it will allow you to run your code even with such obvious mistakes. And it's trying to somehow understand what your intention was by loosely casting stuff to null or false, or even allowing you to access to undefined variables and defaulting to empty strings and stuff like that, which isn't, which basically doesn't scale because you need some robustness out of your application, and you in big applications and big robust applications you actually don't want this behavior. You want to be as strict as possible so
Mm-hmm.
that something unintended doesn't happen. So this is what I liked about Java, and I wanted the same thing in PHP. And at the time there was already fan, PHAN, the first static analyzer for PHP, but when I tried it out, it didn't work very well back then. It wasn't able to finish on Slavomat's code base, even when I gave it an hour to finish. So I thought that I would try to do a better job, and I really liked the beginnings, and it was very addictive to find errors in our code base. And the initial results were very promising, and it was actually very easy to find stuff like usage of undefined classes or undefined functions, and it also performed very quickly on Slavo's code base. And of course, it grew much more from there, and it became much more complicated. And frankly, if I knew in the beginning that it would get complicated so much, I don't know if I would continue. But at this point, I'm happy that I did
Yeah,
because
I'm happy as well. So that's
because it's very difficult to uh, understand how people are were writing code for the past 20 years in a language that didn't force these kinds of checks. So, for example, PHP Stand has to be much smarter than Java compiler because, for example, Java doesn't allow you to define a variable inside an if branch when the else branch, for example, returns when it terminates early. So uh, the Java compiler doesn't figure out that if you just create a variable in an if branch, that you can't use it below the if else statement, even if you know that, for example, the else statement returns or throws an exception and stuff like that. But of course, people in PHP write such code and they expect it to work. So PHP Stand has to understand code like that, even if there was a compiler from the beginning, it would be probably a good idea to allow such code. But because there wasn't a compiler and the PHP was able to tolerate such code, PHP Stand also has to understand the same level of complexity or difficulty with such code.
Yeah, you mentioned writing a static code analysis tool. It brings complexity. It brings in a different mindset because you need to think about code differently.
Yeah.
And where you're using, I know you're using the PHP Parser from Nikita at the moment, right?
Yeah.
Which parses the code into an AST with some kind of token stream where you can see which nodes are in the code base. And
I just lost the stream.
You lose what? Sorry?
I just lost the stream.
But you can hear us, right?
Yeah. I can hear you now. You are moving again. So can
Great.
you maybe repeat the question?
Yeah. So you're using nowadays PHP Parser from Nikita, where you have an abstract syntax tree with nodes in it and a token stream. Were you adapting it early on? Were you using the PHP Parser from the beginning, or were your first steps more or less about parsing the text? How did you start?
So PHP Parser from Nikita Popov gave me a big head start. So I was using it from the beginning.
Okay.
So it made my job a lot easier.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for his parser, I would have to write the parser first. So,
yeah.
And I'm not sure that my skills would be up for that. So I'm glad that the PHP parser already existed.
Yeah, but that's already a barrier, because thinking about PHP code in that manner makes it more difficult, and you have to understand what an AST even is, right?
Yeah.
And I imagine, I remember that once I had an issue with PHP Stand, and I said, well, it's a false positive, no, it's a false negative, and I tried to create a reproducer, and like you should do in open source, I created an issue and I tried to look into the code to understand what's going wrong. But there was, I think it was an hour or so I tried it. Then I realized, well, I know PHP Parser, but it's too complex to get into PHP Stand using PHP Parser and fix this thing. And I thought, well, I'll have a look at the weekend. And it was you, I think, on Friday evening or something, already fixed the issue and tagged the release. So you mentioned it's a complex code base. And how does it scale in maintenance for you?
So there's a lot of things and parts that PHP Stand has to take care of. So there are many different areas in the code base. So probably the most complex one is the one that goes through the AST and tries to update the variable types and other expression types as it goes through the code. So for example, analyzing for each loops and for loops and while loops and stuff like that is very complex, because the analyzer has to go through the AST multiple times so that it understands whether the loop assigns a variable to a single value, or if it does, for example, increment like $e, $i++, semicolon. Because in the first example, you will end up with a variable that has the one as its value, and in the second example, you will end up with a variable that has an integer as its value. So that's something that PHP Stand has to figure out, and there's a lot more stuff like that. So for example, for a long time, PHP Stand had problems understanding continue with a number or break with a number, which is a valid construct in PHP, but PHP Stand simply didn't understand it, and I had to improve the support for this construct later. So this is the most complex part. Other parts are, for example, reflection. So that's PHP Stand's own layer above PHP reflection for figuring stuff about classes and functions, what kind of parameter types and who extends whom and stuff like that. And all of these data are used by PHP Stand rules. So PHPstan rules read all of this data, the types, the AST, the reflection, and tells you when you have some kind of mistake in your code. So the rules are a separate area. And also there are some other things like APIs for custom rules and other extension types. So you can improve the type inference of your own code if there's something special, something magical, some stuff like, for example, underscore call or stuff like that. And also because these things are separated, PHP Stand, besides the error finding part, can also be a foundation for other projects which have different reasons to exist besides finding errors in your code. So for example, we already mentioned Rector. So Rector uses PHP Stand, these mainly the type inference parts, to perform automatic refactorings. So for example, it allows you to upgrade upgrade your code if you are upgrading, for example, Symfony version or Nete version, and it uses PHP Stand internals in specific ways to achieve that.
Yeah, for example, I guess it's like I'm on a node and I want to know if it's an instance of something. Then
Yeah, exactly.
that's where I can use PHP Stand internals in a Rector, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Right. So
I think
this is what the project consists of, and you asked about contributors. So I looked before we started broadcasting, and right now there's almost 300 contributors that have their commits in PHP Stand, but also I have to say that most of them are very minor, are just updating function signatures for PHP functions and classes. But on the other hand, some contributors are very valuable, and about once a year on average, some kind of genius shows up and makes significant contributions that I wouldn't come up with myself, and that's the best kind of contributions that you can get. So, for example, in the beginning, the first few years, it was Jan Tvrdík who wrote the whole PHP doc parser. So PHP Stand not only uses PHP AST, but it also parses the PHP docs that it uses, and it also creates an AST from them. And he also introduced intersection types, and he also introduced literal types. So for example, if you have string with date text, and you use that string as a callable, PHP Stand, thanks to literal types, will know that you are basically calling the date function, and it can tell you that the date string can always be used as callable if you pass the correct arguments to it that are the same as for the date function. So it can work not only with general types like integer string or stuff like that, but it can also work with specific strings like date or numbers and stuff like that. And so that was Honza Tvrdík, and the other significant contributor was Arnaud Leblanc, who worked with me on generics in 2019. So that was a lot of contributions, a lot of pull requests to basically make generics work in PHP Stand.
So the good thing is it's not only on your shoulders, but there are people that help you out. That's great.
Yeah.
But what is from your point of view? Well, I mentioned already that you are really fast in doing patch releases. Sometimes it feels like I'm doing a composer update weekly, and there are two or three patch releases of PHP Stand. So, is that something that you consider something that is critical for the successful management of an open source project?
So what's very addictive to me, what I really believe in, is that web applications should be developed in the manner that you make a change and you can deploy it instantly. So that's what we did at Slevomat, and that's what I also want to do with PHP Stand, although open source is a little bit different in this aspect. I also want to achieve a really similar thing. So my thinking is that when you have some improvements and bug fixes in your pipeline, why you should pile them up. You can release them very often, because why sit on them? Why pile them up. So that's why I try to make a lot of releases, because people are waiting for these bug fixes. And also users can get very nervous when there's right before the next major version, and can't do basically can't do my usual cadence of releases, and I have to wait a little bit. So people are starting to get nervous when there wasn't a release for the last 2 weeks or something like that.
But how do you manage that? Is it something you can do in your can you work on that in your work time, or are you full time on PHP Stand nowadays?
Yeah, I'm actually full time on PHP Stand
Okay,
since this year. So
so that's great news.
I'm really proud that I achieved this, and it's thanks to several income streams. So there's GitHub sponsors, there's PHP Stand Pro, which is a paid extension, paid plugin that I came up with on top of PHP Stand, and some companies are also have a logo in the README that are paying for the placement, basically for support of PHP Stand. And there's also Tidelift, which is a company that basically for their customers, they are scanning their composer JSON, a package JSON, and stuff like that, and they are checking if their licenses are okay, and if there aren't any security vulnerabilities, and they are forwarding some of the money they get from their customers to the maintainers. So that's also one of the income streams that made it possible for me to work full time on PHP Stand.
Yeah, that's really great news, because that ensures that the project is maintained in a sustainable manner, right?
And that also explains the frequent releases.
Yeah, yeah. Other than just pushing patches out as soon as you have them, is there something else you have on mind when talking about release process or release cycle? So how come,
Well,
for example?
it's basically all automated. So when I take a commit in PHP Stand src repo, it builds the far file, phar file, and pushes it to the PHP Stand repo, which is used as composer package, and it creates the release. And the one thing that I do semi manually, half manually, is that the release nodes are generated from the commit history, and they have the issues linked, and the pull request link, and the contributors also mentioned. But I sorted them manually into areas like bug fixes, improvements, new features, function signature fixes. So this is one area that I do manually because I enjoy it, and it's some kind of ritual before every release.
Yeah, it's some kind of a retrospective as well, so you can see again what's happened.
Yeah, and besides the main project part, I also take care of the website, which has a playground where you can try out what PHP Stand will find on your source code, as long as it's just a single file, just a single text area. And there's documentation and things like that.
Yeah, I think that playground is very helpful while creating reproducers. So that's a good thing. So last question before we head to a small break with the game.
Okay.
You already mentioned you made a lot of Java references. So for sure, Java is a source of inspiration for you. And
yeah, because that's what I encountered back in university.
yeah, and you also mentioned that the runtime flow of a PHP application might be quite different and quite dynamic from time to time because of __ call, or maybe some reflection calls as well.
Yeah, and also because people write very complicated code, and sometimes it happens that even they don't understand it. Yeah, some issues are about the fact that people report code, and PHP Stand reports some errors on that code. And when I try to run that code, it actually proves that PHP Stand is correct because it crashes. So people don't realize, some users, some issue submitters don't realize that they have mistakes in their code and they think that PHPstan is wrong, but in fact PHPstan is correct.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I did a lot of modernization projects with intense legacy misusage maybe of PHP as well, and bringing in PHP Stand is always a great benefit, but you always encounter ways how PHP can be misused in a dynamic way that you weren't thinking of before, and I think you've seen a lot of quirks that PHP as a language allows users to do. Um, but I know that we had him on, so I'm talking about Matt. He also had congratulational tweets for you for the 1.0 release. Um, is the relation to Matt, who was the creator of Psalm, something that is inspiring as well, or how is the coexistence of that?
Yeah, so uh, PHP Stand and Sun could be considered competition, but competition in open source is a weird thing, right? Because uh, it's not traditional competition when there isn't a lot of paying customers involved. So we are not fighting over customers or over lots amounts of money or stuff like that. So that's also probably why we are basically friends, and we also met. It's 2 years ago. We've met in Munich, and we had a nice dinner, and it was really great. We chatted for a lot of hours, and we are also in contact very often. We chat and exchange ideas and ask each other questions about how to do this or that. So yeah, it's very friendly collaboration, and I think that I can say that we enjoy each other's presence.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's quite great to hear someone else going through something similar, because maintaining a complex project, like you said, static code analysis tool, that's something that might bound very well. So,
Yeah.
all right, thanks from my side already for the insights. I'd like to hand over to Dennis and for the second half.
Okay.
All right, so let's start with a quiz. So for those of you who don't know it, it's basically an either-or quiz. So we show 2 or 3 things, and you have to decide which one of those would you pick, and you can decide if you'd rather talk a little bit about it because, I don't know, you find it interesting or funny or something like that, or if you just want to go over to the next question. So first one, this one doesn't count. PHP CS fixer or code sniffer?
Code sniffer.
All right.
And
Probably
it's
because of
because
your rule set.
yeah, and if I can give a longer answer, it's because I knew it since 2010 probably, and I wrote a lot of custom sniffs there, and it's much closer to my heart than PHP CS fixer.
All right. The next one, attributes or annotations?
Uh, well, you are forced to use annotations on PHP 7, but you can use attributes on PHP 8. So I think that the future for PHP is to move a lot of stuff in attributes. But before everyone is on PHP 8 or later, we still have to use annotations.
All right. PHP Stand or Psalm?
Why not both?
That's actually something I hear often, and also that I often use in projects, because you mentioned it's more of a collaboration and not really competition. And actually, PHP Stand and Psalm together on a project works. For some reason, you sometimes find stuff that PHP Stand doesn't find with Psalm, and the other way around. So it
Yes,
can actually
because
be
both tools they have the same goal, but they are implemented very differently, and that's on the edges. You can find a lot of stuff where one tool will find it and the other will not going to find the problem, and it also always changes as we release new versions and improve the tools and stuff like that.
All right. And Twitter or Reddit?
I used to like Twitter more, but now I'm very addicted to Reddit because I like Reddit and the community a lot. Not specifically PHP community, but what I like most about Reddit is that every time I finish some kind of TV series or a new episode of a TV show, I go on Reddit and read the comments from the community about story theories and stuff like that. So that's my little guilty pleasure.
Right. So Alexander mentioned in the chat that my volume is low this time. I can't up it anymore. So maybe Christopher, you can check that. But we can still keep talking because you should do most of the talking anyway. And
I
I would
can I
like
can hear you
to
well, so it's not a problem on your machine.
hopefully it's just a recording. So yeah, let's talk about PHP Stand and the 1.0 release. So in the release announcement, you mentioned that it's been 6 years you've been working on PHP Stand, and there've been ton of releases. So why do the 1.0 now? Was there any specific reason, or was it just
Yeah,
a good
because
time?
users were pressuring me more and more often to do it, and I don't yield to pressure very often, but I realized that I already spent several years without creating a BC break or without releasing another major version. Like I also considered 0.10, 0.11, 0.12 like major versions. So when I realized that I was going for more than a year without releasing 0.13. I realized that probably releasing 1.0 as next is a good idea. Is the next logical step.
And despite I think the PR effect of the 1.0, was there anything on the feature side or on PHP Stand side that you wanted to make sure that the 1.0 release had? You mentioned that you were already kind of BC break free in that time, but what was there something that is, yeah, kind of a 1.0 big feature that you wanted to have?
Yeah, so there's new level 9, which is quite brutal, and it's about when you have mixed in your code before PHP Stand 1.0. Um, Nothing was reported on mixed, so you could call methods on mixed. You could pass it to more specific type because mixed can mean anything. It means that the user didn't specify their type. So level 9 actually disallows you to do anything useful with mixed because you first have to make sure that the method exists. You first have to narrow down the type from mixed to something more specific to be able to do something with it. So the only thing that you can do with mixed is to pass it to another mixed, for example, as a method parameter and nothing else. So it's quite brutal when you, for example, unserialize some stuff or you call JSON decode and then you want to do some things with the data, with the decoded data, and you can't because everything is mixed and you first make sure that you have the correct types before you move on. So it gives your application a lot more type safety, but at the same time, it's really brutal in existing applications because it's really hard to satisfy the level 9. And besides that, there are around 25 new rules, not just for level 9 but for all the levels, because I um, still want to keep the spirit of the existing levels and to add more stuff to them if it fits the level well. So I also add rules to existing levels, and there are also around 200 improvements and bug fixes in 1.0.
So people should basically eagerly upgrade to 1.0 to get all those new rules and especially the new level. That probably sounds interesting, especially for new projects. Um,
Yeah,
and
what I also want to mention, sorry, is that I perhaps cheated a bit because the last 0.12 release was, I think, around middle of September, and I released 1.0 on 1st November, but I didn't develop develop all this stuff in the half and in the month and a half, because I also, when I talk about continuous delivery, continuous improvement and integration, when I work on a new feature, I don't do it in a feature branch. I make it part of the released PHP Stand version, even in a minor version, but it's turned off by default. I call this feature set the bleeding edge. And when you include the bleeding edge configuration file, you get basically features that are in development that I consider good enough, and I'm looking for feedback. So and the next major version is about making all these things be turned on by default for all users. So at that point, where when I released the 1.0, there was a lot of features that lived in PHP Stand code base for maybe even a year, and that were well tested by the bleeding edge users. So this is my way of gathering early feedback, and also the way that I don't have too many long feature branches because they are hard to maintain, and I would rather have it all ship in the stable version but behind a feature toggle.
And that probably also makes upgrading a little bit safer because people already played around with it. So you don't have to worry about the new features, because that's something that I noticed. So this week I upgraded PHP Stand in one of my projects, and usually, especially from a beta to a stable release, you expect a few things that have to adjust or stuff like that. But it was just smoothly. And the only trouble I had was that was on level max, and our project doesn't like that. So level 9 is a little bit far away for us now. But are there any things that people should watch out for when they upgrade to 1.0 from an older version?
Well, from users' perspective, I think that people with huge baselines would might have some problems, because I changed the format in which some types are reported in error messages to make the descriptions closer to how you write the same type in PHP docs. So, for example, with array shapes, you write them using the curly brackets in PHP docs, but in PHP Stand 0.12, they were reported with with traditional parentheses in error messages. So I unified these type descriptions, but baselines are based on ignored error messages. So if you had a lot of error messages ignored about array shapes, you might have some problems, and you would have to regenerate the baseline, and at the same time be careful and make sure that you are not losing on the new errors reported by the new version, which might uncover some real bugs. And from the perspective of extension developers, the list of BC breaks looked quite big, but that's just because it was exhaustive. I wrote about every little thing I changed, but the real impact is very small. Most extensions get update with a few simple changes in a few minutes. It's not that hard.
And since you're mentioning extensions, and you already mentioned that, for example, Rector is using a lot of the internal tools that PHP Stand is built on, does the 1.0 release and the stable release change anything for them in terms of maybe release cycles, or in terms of what they can expect? Can they expect a more stable API, for example, stuff like that? Or is basically everything going on the same for if you have an extension, or if you're like Rector and you're building on PHP Stand?
So Rector released their 0.12 version today with support for PHP Stand 1.0. So I made sure that the transition is seamless for them. And I actually had one or two calls with Tomáš Votruba, the main Rector maintainer, and I helped him with some stuff. The main thing that made some issues for them was that I made an optimization. So when I parse the ASD, I cache the results in memory. I don't cache it to disk because it's questionable how fast is reading a serialized ASD versus how fast is it to parse the PHP source code. It might be similar, but when I already parse the file and then I need the AST for that file second time, I just read it from some PHP array in memory. And the optimization I did is that I'm not interested in the method bodies, the function bodies in some situations. So I'm interested in function and method bodies when it's about the analyzed source code, when it's about the first party code that you are writing, then that you are analyzing. But I'm not interested in the method bodies in third party code. I'm only interested in the function signatures and the PHP docs. So before I cache the AST of third party code, I actually remove the method bodies, so that can save me a lot of memory, a lot of consumed memory. It saved around 100 megabytes when running on PHPstan itself, so I knew that it was valuable, but it made the upgrade a little bit more difficult for him for Rector. So I helped him to configure PHPstan correctly so that Tomáš could use PHPstan, could continue to use PHPstan for this purpose.
That's cool that basically, since it's another related open source project, that you can help each other out and basically have this symbiosis. That's something I really like about the open source mentality in general. So
Yeah, so it benefits me when everyone is on PHPstan 1.0 because everyone gets the latest features, and that's also why PHPstan still supports PHP 7.1, because I would rather have everyone on the latest version than limit the users to more recent PHP versions.
And so, since I already mentioned you want to keep the long PHP version, will this trend keep going when you develop new things as well? That you try to have the same mentality where you basically try to keep everyone on board with if you're on 1.0 now, you should also be ready for 2.0, for example, later on.
Yeah, so actually the version numbers are just a cosmetic thing, right? So I would I could also call the current PHPstan version 13.0, and it would be the same project. It would be the same project behind it. So it's just a cosmetic thing, really, right? But uh, I I realized and I wanted to somehow I wanted to honor that the 1.0 is a big thing. So I also wrote two documents called backward compatibility promise, and that's backward compatibility promise for users, and another article called backward compatibility promise for developers. And these two documents are also one of the things that I released alongside PHPstan 1.0, and they talk about how I want to keep the backward compatibility in the future, in the minor and patch releases. So it's keeping backward compatibility is quite challenging in a project like PHPstan, because when I'm doing any bug fix, any improvement, I can always break someone's build, because uh, one person's bug fix can be another person's failed build, because they might had some different situation in their source code, and when their build was green before, it might now fail because PHPstan has different information about their code. So that's quite challenging, and that's what the backward compatibility promise document is talking about. So I'm promising that I'm not going to remove any configuration options. I'm not going to change any user-facing things like command line arguments and stuff like that. But the thing that will always change is how PHPstan is smart about your code, and that's something important to realize when working with it and when upgrading versions.
And speaking of backward compatibility, how will it be with forward compatibility? So PHP 8.1 is coming out now, and so basically you also widen the gap to the future. That's probably challenging as well, right?
So the support for next PHP version has several aspects to it. So one is to make sure that PHP Stand works on the latest version. So I had to fix some deprecations. The most work was to because PHP now requires it has something called tentative return types, and it wants you to if you are, for example, implementing some internal interface or you are extending some PHP class, it wants you to have the correct return type. So you can either write the correct return type, for example, get iterator when you are implementing iterator aggregate interface, you have to use the traversable return type hint, or if you can't for some reason, you can use the temporary return type will change attribute. And this was the biggest amount of work to make PHP Stand work without any deprecations on PHP 8.1. And when I actually make sure that PHP Stand 1.0 works on PHP 8.1 without any problems. But a lot of work is also to make sure that the new features from the new PHP version are supported. So that's something that I'm currently working on. Some features were already released. So since PHP 7.0 was released 10 days ago, I already made around 5 more releases, and some of them added support for new PHP 8.1 features. Yeah, and you probably asked if I want to drop old PHP versions from the supported versions by PHPstan or something like that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so basically the question is, so if you start supporting all those new features that are only available for PHP 8.0 and 8.1, and people are still able to use PHP Stand for 7.1, where maybe some features can be removed once you support once you remove the support for these older PHP version. So you accrue a lot of basically dead code depending on which version you run, and you still have to make sure that it, as you said, it has to work with 8.1 even though you don't use that feature. So I can imagine that that's a lot of work to check all these versions and to maintain all these versions together. So yeah, was just curious if it's basically just a thing that you wanted to have for the beta release so that people go to the stable 1.0 release, where you want to make sure it's still the same version, or if you want to continue to do that even with 2.0, because it's probably easier to maintain like 1 or 2 major version branches versus 0.10, 0.11, 0.12, 1.0 now. Yeah, so that was my question.
Yeah, so from now on, I only want to work on the PHP 1.1.0, or now it's already in 1.1 range. I don't want to maintain 0.12 anymore. But the hardest part about keeping support for multiple PHP versions are the dependencies. So not PHPstan, but other projects are already abandoning old PHP versions. So that's actually the hardest part, that I can't use the latest dependencies for my project. But I don't consider it a hassle. I consider it more of a challenge, and also one of the interesting things when I work on PHP Stand. So there are some projects that allow you to downgrade your PHP code, and that's something that I can take advantage of, because the source code of PHP Stand and the distribution package are two different Git repositories. So I work on PHP Stand source code in PHP Stand SRC, but then the code is compiled into a FAR file. And thanks to this build step, this compilation step, I can actually do whatever I want to the source code. So for example, in PHP Stand SRC, the source code, I already have typed properties, which are only supported from PHP 7.4 upwards. But the FAR file, the PHP Stand distribution, still supports PHP 7.1, because one of the build steps, I remove those type properties. I only leave the type in the PHP doc. So that's how I can do it. But these downgrade possibilities are not yet robust for me to also convert the vendor source code from other packages, because not everything is covered by these downgrading possibilities. But that's also something that I want to invest in the future.
Speaking of future changes, so you already mentioned that you have the bleeding edge branch, or you had it for beta. You probably still have it for basically things planned for 2.0. Is there already something in there that you're working on that may end up in the next major version?
Once I finish support for PHP endpoint 1, I'm not sure if I will be able to release everything before PHP endpoint 1 is released at the end of November. Maybe the work will continue into December, but a lot of stuff is already released. And as I mentioned, PHP Stand works well on PHP endpoint 1. It's just that if you write some enumerations or you write read-only properties, not everything is checked. Not everything is checked on them as it could be how you would expect it from a static analyzer. But one thing that I want to tackle is to detect wrong @var annotations in PHP source code. That's quite a lot misused feature, right? @var annotations. It's similar to inline casts in Java. So it's completely unsafe, and people might use it for different purposes. So one purpose is that they just want to correct wrong. They just want to correct wrong third-party PHP docs, and every time they call a third-party method or function, they have to add their own @var tag in that piece in that place in the source code, so that PHPstan and Sun and IDE are aware of the correct type. But because people use these PHP doc tags for different purposes, the static analyzer cannot report any errors on this annotation, because it's not sure what's the actual source of truth for this type, and who is right and who is wrong. So it's very challenging, but people have a lot of mistakes in these @var annotations. So that's something that I want to look into. And one idea I have is that PHPstan should be aware when a type is coming from a PHP doc or from a native type hint. So for example, if you are assigning some kind of variable and you are assigning some result from a method call, I can look at the native type hint of the method call, and I can make sure that the @var above the method call has a similar type to that of the native type. So for example, if you are calling a method that has a native string return type, I can definitely report an error if you then cast the type to an integer, for example. But I can't report this error if the called method has string in a PHP doc and you are casting that to integer. That might just be fixing the error from the third-party PHP doc.
That's actually quite interesting, because I encounter this @var a lot, and I do this a lot as well. Mostly when, as mentioned, I have a third-party library and their typing is sometimes they even have types, but it's just too many, and I know that this specific one is coming back. A good example is where you basically can configure if you return errors or don't return errors, and suddenly you have nullable or an exception or something like that, and that can get quite messy. So having tags, having checks on the tag annotations, because as you mentioned that they are easily wrong either in the beginning because you had copy and paste errors, or maybe the library changed. That sounds like a huge thing, but probably also really tricky to implement, because as you mentioned, the var tag is basically just some text someone wrote. So how can you decide what's right and what's not?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but one thing that I would recommend to our listeners, to the audience, is that you should try to remove all inline @var tags from your code base and you should see what PHP Stand reports without them. And you should try to fix these errors in a different way. So one thing that PHP Stand offers is a feature called stub files. So with stub files, you can actually overwrite wrong third-party PHP docs. Or you can also introduce, for example, generics to a third-party library that doesn't use them. And all of this can help you avoid inline vertex.
And of course, you can also do if condition checks and stuff like that for the different types that you expect, where basically the code actually checks what you're expecting instead of doing that well, right? And yeah, so that's one big feature. One I'm really looking forward for. Are there anything else that you have on the list that you want to do? Maybe even that's just an idea you have.
Well, my to-do lists have hundreds of ideas, hundreds of items in it, so it's hard to pick something up from it. But PHP endpoint one support with all of the features, all the deprecations, and the Vertex are the next two things that I want to tackle as next.
All right, and you also mentioned that you have contributors that sometimes do big changes. Do you already have the once a year contributor for 2021 with a big change coming up, or?
There's lot of pull requests lately were contributed by Markus Stab or Markus Stab. I don't know how his name is pronounced, and he's doing a lot of small bug fixes that I probably wouldn't have time to get into. So big props to him.
And did you already get some feedback for PHP Stand 1.0 where people, I mean, all the stuff I saw was people being excited about the release and finally having a stable version. But do you have concrete feedback on things that people expect or that people are looking forward for?
Well, to paint a little picture, I have 9,600 emails in my inbox. So
okay.
Yeah.
So you have enough work for the next year as well.
No, not exactly. It's I'm using my inbox that I read every incoming email like immediately, but then I mark it as unread when I want to do some action on it later. So I already fixed some bugs that were reported on the early versions, and when I basically every day is a fight because, for example, I process like 15 emails and do proper bug fixes and do regression tests and stuff like that, and 15 more emails arrive. So kind of difficult to get down to get this number down, but I'm trying, and it's going well.
Well, that's good to hear. So you also already mentioned like first of all that you can work on this full time, which is sound really great for the community, and you seem to have fun with it. So probably for you as well. But yeah, you mentioned that besides GitHub sponsors, one of the things that is part of your income stream is PHP Stand Pro. Is there? Do you want to shift focus to that as well, or add new features to that as well, or is it basically what you want right now? It works as an income stream, so better not change it too much.
Yeah, so it's always a challenge to choose what I should work on, because I really love working on the open source part. But from business perspective, it would make more sense for me to work on PHP Stand Pro and make it more likable or make it indisposable for users. So that's always a challenge. What I should work on next. So right now I'm mostly procrastinating on the open source version, but it's for everyone's benefit. So there's really nothing to complain about. Yeah.
All right. With that, maybe a reminder into the YouTube chat. So if you have any questions to Ondrej on PHP Stand, his work as maintainer, also obviously you can, even though he got many congratulations, you can still congratulate on version 1.0. Please do that now because we are about to wrap up. And I don't know, maybe Christopher, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, while hearing you speak, I was thinking, well, Andre, you really are. Um, there is an impact of PHP RCs to your work, right? So if there are new features like type properties, that might be a yay for you. But if there are some things like enums, that might be something very new that needs a lot of work to get into PHP Stand's type inference, right? So are there moments where you think, oh come on, please don't vote that? It's very painful to implement.
Well, it would be a bad idea for me to uh, not wish for some RFC to go through, because I always welcome when the PHP language improves. But of course, some features are more challenging than others. So, for example, the I expect the enums to to mean the most work for me for the upcoming release, because I have to update a lot of code. So enums are the next class-like type to PHP stand. So to PHP, so you have classes, you have interface, you have traits, and now they are enums. So every piece of code that does, if this is class, then do something. If this is interface, do something else. If this is trait, do something different. I have to add another condition that asks about enums, and that's a lot of places, lot of assumptions this way. And also enums are quite complicated, and there's a lot of opportunities for custom checks by PHP Stand that the users, the developers are writing and using enums correctly.
Okay, so you as well are looking. You're really looking forward to the next PHP release, and maybe that's something we can cover in the next episode. We don't have a definite yes or date at the moment, but you have some contact to Tomasz and Rector. Maybe might one day also have a first major release, so that would be very interesting as well. But Dennis and I will continue with this series, and we will publish across the next announcement in a few weeks, hopefully with the next episode. Ondrej, thanks a lot for being here. Thanks a lot for your work on PHP Stand. I can say from my point of view that it helps tons of developers in the daily work, and it's really valuable. I'm looking forward to the T-shirt to arrive in Berlin, and I think that's something everyone could do. Have a look at the sponsor page or have a look at the merchandise. If you really look forward to adopting enums in your code base, think about Ondrej's work while bringing it to PHP Stand as well. So that's really valuable.
Thank you very much.
All right.
12 more days to buy the merchandise.
So maybe we can share that link in the chat as well. All right. Any famous last words from your side?
Oh, I think that we've covered everything, and I'm really happy that I could be a part of this series. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks, have a good day and bye.
Bye. See you around.
Okay, thank you. Bye.